You are listening to Season with Salt, the podcast, and I am your host, Dominique Beaumonte. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. I have something very interesting to talk about today. Some of you who are regular listeners may or may not know, unless you follow me on social, that the Lord has led me to the Lord has recently led me to begin the process of launching a church. And it has created for me a season that is full, do you hear me? Full of a lot of emotions, highs and lows, peaks and valleys, opportunities to learn both people and places and things and processes. Like, I'm just learning a lot. I'm learning a lot about people. I'm learning a lot about myself. I'm learning a lot about my relationship with God. And what is of great importance for me in this season is to really stay grounded in what I know to be the fruit of obedience. And in case you're wondering, like, what do you mean about fruit of obedience? Think about when you were a child and you made mistakes that might be, I don't know, just things that you've done. Your parents, if your parents were similar to mine, would always encourage you to reflect on the benefit of listening. If you would have did what I told you to do, if you would have listened to me when I told you X, Y, and Z, this would have happened, or this would not have happened. And so in my life, what I have found to be true is jumping right in on obedience as soon as possible. And there might be some people that are going to be troubled with some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And I understand that because some of my journey to obedience to God has been at the expense of other people's vision. A year ago or so, a little over a year, I don't know, sometime before, the Lord told me to do something. He told me to launch a church. And he began to pour into me vision. He began to encourage me to really hone in on my skill set. And earlier, probably about 2017, the Lord reminded me, like, it's not time now, but I am preparing you for something. And in that season of life, I was like, okay, Lord, I'm 37 years old and I need to do something to respond to what you are telling me is my trajectory. I need to do something to respond in faith. So I decided I've already got a master's degree, but I'm going to go back and get my master's of divinity. I'm going to be educationally prepared as I hope to be spiritually when God releases me. So I start doing that. Once I come to the end of that program, that's around the time that I approached my pastor at the time and said, hey, this is where God is leading me. This is what I see in the future, and I've got these questions, for you as a person, because I'd taken this church planning class, maybe in like 2018, 2019, probably like 2018, and I remember like all the talk in this class being about successful church planners or people who are sent. All the podcasts and all these YouTube videos and books all talked about somebody sending you, having the affirmation of a mentor or somebody. And so I thought, yeah, I'm going to get that. I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to my pastor. It wasn't the experience that I was expecting. The conversation didn't go the way that I expected it to go at that particular time. In that moment, I think that what the person who was mentoring me thought about was less about my own trajectory and calling, but more about what I had learned that was supposed to be the role of someone who sins. And so it was clear to me in that moment that I would be able to rely on him as a mentor, but not as a sender, if that makes sense. In other words, I could rely on his wisdom. I could rely on him providing me opportunities to grow in this particular area as a person who wanted or felt called to pastor and wanted to pastor. But I could not rely on him in this traditional sense that other people say, this is what the person is, no, he wasn't going to give me a salary for 2 years. He wasn't going to purchase a bill. He wasn't going to send people. And some of that is not an indictment on him as much as it's an indictment on the way that our Reformation understands church planting. So initially I was like, oh wow, okay. Over time, I realized that when God puts something in your heart, when God prepares you to do something, we have all these systems in place that we think are supposed to just come and act like God said do it and I said yes. And so now resources come to me, buildings come to me, people come to me, like everything is attracted to my obedience. And that's not necessarily the truth, right? My testimony now is that God does do that. But we're talking about at the time. Like I had to realize that how I was expecting it was not necessarily the way that God was going to do it, right? So time had passed, and maybe like 3 or 4 years, 5 years passed, and an afternoon, I felt like this person who mentored me had become more reflective, more concerned about two things, in my opinion: his ministry legacy and personal security, and just making sure that he was covered because he knew what stage of life that he was in. But this one afternoon in June, I think it was about June 13th. I shouldn't even forget this because he phoned me or I phoned him. I can't remember. He was talking about something like he normally does, and normally, like people who have a mentorship relationship with someone older, that generally they lead. Like not a business transaction, but a mentorship relationship. Like you are only going to get out of the relationship what you prepare your heart and your mind to hear from their voice. So doing a bunch of talking is not ideal in a relationship like this. So I usually would avail myself. I'd open myself because I'm going to hear something that God is going to speak through him that might not be intentional, but just might be something that I can write down. So I'd always be writing things down when he would talk. Got it, all that stuff that's aiding me, especially in this season. But this particular day, I just felt like we're going to rehash that previous conversation. And I said to him, Pastor, for the years that I've been here, almost 20 years, whenever you have talked about your trajectory as a pastor, you have referenced your predecessor. And I said, one day, I am going to be in a similar situation, and I made very sure to tell him I'm not talking about being the pastor of the church that you are the pastor of. I'm talking about in general. This is the trajectory. I've communicated to you that this is God's calling, and you've even invested in that in so many ways. But there's going to come a day where I'm going to be repeating things that you have said to people who see me as a leader. And from your most purest place, and these are the words that I told him. I said, Pastor, I want to be in trouble. I want you to give me some feedback about something I've done or said, because I just never got in trouble. Like I would be hearing what other people have done wrong, and he would be leading me and coaching me on how I should deal with it, but I never actually got in trouble for something that I did. And he started just like telling me these things, and it wasn't like a reprimands, like on Tuesday you did this and this person responded to this way, but it was like God was speaking through him, and he said some things to me that were so profound that I don't even know. I haven't even told anybody this, maybe one person, but he said some things to me that were so profound that he had no idea that on the other side of this random 35-minute conversation that was, I think, about convocation or something, he said to me some things that were so profound that I was speechless and in tears and could not respond. Like I just did not know what to say. And when he had come up for breath, when he had taken this moment to kind of see where I was at, I was so overwhelmed that I cut the conversation short because I felt like somebody had just given me the greatest gift that I could ever receive. And hopefully one day I'll be able to kind of share some of the things that he told me. But listen, what that did for me was it catapulted me into this season of obedience, and I did not know it, because sometimes people make us believe that our legacy and our destiny are attached to people. And I think early on, when I confessed to him what I wanted to do in life, his resistance, and it wasn't like he didn't believe that I was called. It was a different kind of resistance, right? It was more about other things, right? But his resistance was intentional, because it was one of the ways that God began to communicate to me that, hey, I'm the sovereign Lord, and whatever I say goes. And you're gonna find that your dependence on systems and people and mentorship and affirmation and all these things that we feel like we need on earth, you're gonna find that none of that matters. So fast forward, months later, I'm just sort of navigating this season of like, what am I going to do next? And things start happening in life. People start contacting me about interviewing for roles to pastor. Like, decide I'm going to put my name in the hat to pastor at the church where he pastored after his demise. And then all of these things start happening literally in the same week. I was being considered to pastor several churches. And the Lord said to me, like, when are you going to realize that everything that I have for you is attached to your obedience and not to systems of comfort that you have been subscribing to? And these systems of comfort are not just my relationship with my former pastor. They are my ideas about what it means to have a master's of divinity or be a doctoral student, what it means to have roles in Christendom, whether it's in my Reformation or in my... I was relying on all these systems, and God said, hey, if you don't learn to commit yourself to a season of responsibility and obedience to my word and to what I have said, you are not going to find success. And I've not attached myself to the things for you that you think I have. And I was like, Lord, but these things are so much easier. These things are more accomplishable. They are more in reach with what I like. I just wanted to do the easy route. So anyway, I said yes to God. I yielded to him. I said, okay, God, got it. I'm going to do it. I'm ready to go gung-ho. I will do what it is that you want me to do. So I said yes. I said, God, I'm not going to run from this. I'm not going to operate in fear. I'm going to do exactly what you told me to do. So I started doing it. And two things started happening simultaneously. I started seeing the fruit of obedience, but I also started seeing a backlash that I didn't expect, because I thought that God and the people around me, and I just thought that, especially those that were connected, I thought everybody was just gonna be like, oh my God. Like, I just not affirming. I just didn't think that there would be sort of this sort of negative view. I didn't know what to do with that. So I'm having these highs and lows, right? God would send people to call me to say, hey, I don't know why, but God told me to give you X amount of money. Or somebody would say, hey, such and such told me that you're looking for a building. I'm not looking for a building. Yes, you are. Call this person. Like, things started happening for me, much about what I can't even articulate at this point, because even sometimes it's so shocking. On the flip side of that, I started experiencing this warfare that was so lot that I didn't anticipate. And sometimes when we talk about warfare, like we talk about it from the context of like, oh, the devil don't want me to do such and such. And so here is how I'm warring against these external factors, right? Here's how I'm experiencing the pit of hell revolt, right? Like, and it hasn't been that. It's been people that I've been in fellowship and community with that have been most problematic. And I'm not saying that because I want people to have any type of sympathy on me. I'm saying this because somebody else is at the precipice of obedience, and you're going to be obedient, and I don't want you to be caught off guard like I was. Like, I had to come to a prayerful and spiritual neutrality around how I would interpret, respond to people who, even with the best of intentions, questioned my obedience to God, because in their mind, it just doesn't make sense, right? So let me just let me express to you sort of the way that the Lord began to really minister to my heart. First of all, I think it's important to know that there is unseen struggle connected to obedience that may not be viewable on the surface. And people struggled in general to see beyond their own need. And a lot of people, because of their operation in their own context, will not be able to understand and interpret the vision or the dream that God gave you. If you are expecting that, you are setting yourself up for failure. Because it's kind of like, if you think about it from this context, because I've had the privilege of being promoted and leaving one company to go to another. There are people at the company that you leave who should probably leave too, but they are adamant about how difficult it is for them to see somebody else leave that they find to be valuable to the system, even though they too, in their heart, know that they need to leave. And I'm not talking about this in a church perspective. I'm talking about this in a natural, in a workforce environment, right? And those people, in general, especially if they do not plan to leave, their excitement about your departure is contingent upon their own ability to meet their needs and or be successful in your absence. So if you play an integral role on that work team and you're departing, then you look a certain way to those people, and they're not only wrestling with your general departure, but they're wrestling with what the next phase of their success will look like without you. So this is not necessarily a negative thing per se. I think it's a stage that people can grow from or grow out of. I think it's an opportunity, it's a management opportunity, if you will, in the infrastructure that you're departing from, to figure out how to fill a void. But sometimes that doesn't happen, right? And so people can struggle to see beyond their own needs. And I think one of the things that you must do as an act of obedience, as a response to your obedience, is you've got to learn how to navigate somebody else's reluctance without taking it personal, right? And not to assume that everybody who is reluctant is a hater, or everybody who is struggling is jealous of your success, or whatever it might be. Because one of the sort of misunderstandings about obedience is that some people are anticipating some kind of immediate success, and they don't know that the struggle with obedience is you don't always experience success right away, right? And you have to be careful about that. The other thing I think is important when we're talking about the backside of obedience is it can feel very isolating. And I think isolation is twofold, right? There is the isolation that comes naturally when you are trying to separate yourself from things in accordance with your obedience to God. And then there is the isolation where people do not know what to do with their emotions, their thoughts, so they are creating isolation for you. Whether it's not speaking or mentioning to you like the weight of your obedience on their life, or trying to make you feel guilty, or you might feel like you don't have anybody to talk to in certain seasons of obedience because people don't know how to listen to you without like expressing their own context. There's a lot of different things that are happening. And here is the thing, and I learned this. Isolation, especially as it connects to obedience, is one of the most powerful things that you can experience, because whenever you are walking in obedience, you have to learn how to eliminate the voices, the influences in your head, because you don't want for somebody else's voice or influence to be warring with the voice of God. One example of how that happens is well-intentioned, fun-loving people will say to you, "Are you sure?" Or, "I just don't think you're going to be able to get that amount of money." Or, "What if this?" Or, "What if that?" Or, "How are you going to deal with this?" And sometimes well-intentioned people can bring up enough questions that it will seed doubt in your heart about, should I have been obedient? I remember when I decided to have a conversation with my pastor at the time about getting ordained. And there was a lot of fear attached to that. I started preaching when I was 9 years old. I took some breaks, and when I was ready to say yes to God, it was very similar to the season that I'm in now. I was having some very difficult life transition kind of things happening. And I was trying to like figure out how to balance expectations for people in their 30s, but I also was like, God, I just want to ultimately, this is like, I got the energy, I got the capacity, I got the resources to really walk in obedience, and I just want to do that. And I remember like just really struggling with like taking that step. And I took that step, and I'm like, okay, things started unfolding for me in amazing ways as a result of that agreement to be obedient with God. But the other thing that started happening is people in my circle were like, "Oh no, now that you're going to get ordained, we got to be careful what we say, or you're not going to do this with us, or you're not going to go." And people weren't really saying that they were unwilling to continue in our friendship. They were speaking from a point of insecurity because they were concerned that somehow my obedience would equate to our friendship not being what it had been. And so sometimes I would neutralize that, like, "Oh, you're tripping, like, it ain't gonna be like that." And then sometimes I would be like, yeah, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. I might not do that. Like, I might not sit in the bar during happy hour, even if I'm not having a drink, because the season might not allow for that. But I noticed a lot of reluctance, and I noticed that it wasn't just what I did, but my confession to be obedient to God in the company of my friends created isolation that I didn't have to do anything to nurture or manage. Some people were just like, nah, I'm not the place in my life that I can support that transition because it means something for me and I just don't want to deal with it. And initially I was trying to fight for these relationships and realize it's to my benefit to let it go, right? Because if I let it go, then I wouldn't be warring with who God was making me into with who I was leaving, if you know what I'm saying. So isolation is a part of the package. And sometimes obedience will feel like betrayal. People will take your obedience personally. They will interpret your obedience as abandonment, as disloyalty. They will interpret it as rejection. And you have to learn how to navigate that season. You will feel pressured to defend your obedience, you're going to have to figure out how to unpack. Like, it is so exhausting to be regularly explaining and justifying and proving and explaining and justifying and improving what God said to you. And you're going to have to come to a place where the only way that I can prove to somebody that doesn't want to hear what I'm saying that this is the will of God is God's going to have to show them. Because I can't be continuing in this cycle of trying to prove to you something that you really don't want to hear. Right? And so we got to think about this, because Jesus himself, he faced this opposition from religious leaders all the time because his obedience didn't align with their expectations, because he was like, no, I'm creating new culture that's going to be uncomfortable because it alienates people from their comfort zone in a way that is going to create dissidence between me and these systems. But he didn't back down. He didn't say, okay, Father, did you hear what they said? Did you hear how they questioned me? How they looked at me? How they did this? How they did that? He knew that he had to be obedient. So here is what I know works. Here's what I know works. I know that God honors our moving forward with confidence. I know that. And I want to remind you that following God's call does not require everybody's approval. Hear me. You do not need everybody's approval. You do not need everybody's affirmation. You do not need everybody's money. You do not need everybody's high five. You do not need everybody's attendance. You do not need everybody's resources. You do not need it. You don't need it. You do not need it. Now, this is when you're being obedient to God. This is not when you're starting a business venture, or because if you are selling a product, you need people. Right? If you're just being an entrepreneur, this won't apply to you. But if your entrepreneurial endeavor is connected to obedience with God, you do not need people to say, hey, I'm with you. The people will come. The business will come. The strategy will come, because God honors the confidence that we put in him as a result of our obedience. So that's important. If you're wrestling with a similar situation, or you're in a similar season, and you're trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do? I want you to just reflect on these truths. Obedience will cause you comfort. It will cause you approval. It may even cost you relationships, but it will never cost you the presence of God. You might not be in the presence of people that you thought were with you 100%, but you will not lose the presence of God when you're being obedient to him. And I want to pose this question to you. And this is the question that I'm regularly asking myself. What is God calling you to do that others may not understand? And will you do it anyway? And I want you to eliminate the 5 and 6 and 7 people in your community, on your front bench, at your doorstep, that you feel like you have to get affirmation from. Now, if you're married and God is calling you to something, that you do need to talk it over with your spouse. We're not talking about that. But we're talking about because God will confirm with people that he needs to confirm what he needs to confirm. I'd love to hear about your own experiences and what God is saying, but I want to pray. And I'm praying this prayer for you, and I'm praying it for me, because I believe that in this season, he's calling for people who will be unafraid to walk in his obedience. Here it is. Father, you see the people who are still listening, and some of them are comfortable in what you have called them to do. And so you have shed light on the pain of obedience, while other people are at the front door of obedience, afraid to knock and see what is on the other side because of the way that they have been trained and encircled, and they're not sure what to do next because they know that what they have to do for you is hard. Would you strengthen them as a result of their time listening? Would you prepare them for what is next? Would you give them the courage, the resources, the wherewithal, the capacity, the things they need to move forward with strength? Would you give them clear vision? Would you give them clear understanding? Would you open their eyes to what is difficult to see now? Would you show them a glimpse of what's to come down the road? Would you remind them of the fruit of obedience so that they can do what you have called them to do without reluctance or intrepidation? Father, I thank you for what you have spoken through me and what you intend to do in the earth through your children who decide to be obedient to you. In Jesus' name, amen.